This series is being run together jointly with Frontline and the Center for Investigative Journalism at City University. It was intended to show most of these international investigations, particularly those that gave a loud hailer to those without a voice, and told a story many companies and officials would rather not have been told. The subject tonight, as you know, is asbestosis, which is a mass-produced industrial material that has literally killed thousands of workers and was very little known by the public, and certainly there was no encouragement for the kind of investigation that John mounted. John worked in investigations as a documentary maker at Yorkshire, and he did two other films that are quite well known. And one is Johnny Go Home, and the other is the Rampton Hospital story, which had a huge audience at the time. And this one, of course, I think in many ways was even bigger, because its effect medically and legally and politically was probably greater. I mean, John can talk to you about that. But but he then went on to do First Tuesday. I've made some notes. There are quite a lot. Channel 4 controller of factual programs. He was involved in Cutting Edge, True Stories, and Secret History, which are probably the best things that they've ever done. In 2003, he was chief executive of United Productions and joined the BBC's executive committee in 2003 as head of factual and running. And prior to that, he ran national programming at WGBH in Boston. The subject tonight is extremely important in terms of the medical question of mesothelioma and the issues around it. But without my saying anything further, John Willis.
Well, sorry, I feel I should be singing Frank Sinatra hits, actually, with the microphone so close. But thank you very much for coming, and Gavin, thank you for that gracious introduction. It's quite strange looking at a film again that you made 25 years ago this year, and you suddenly start to see it in a different way. You remember people who you'd half forgotten, places you'd been to that you kind of remember where they are. But it was a very important moment, I suppose, in the lives of all of us who made the programme. And I'm particularly pleased that one of my colleagues on the programme, Peter Moore, who's sitting in the third row, who was one of the researchers on the programme, but has since gone on to be a commissioner at Channel 4 and win lots of awards for programmes like Jamie's Kitchen. But Peter and I formed a kind of great bond working on that programme, so it's great that Peter's here. And seeing it again, I was kind of struck by a number of things. The first was how ITV it was. This was a programme that was 2 hours long, that was shown at 9 o'clock for the first hour, and then it was meant to be at 10:30, but I'll come on to that, at 10:35 for the second hour. So it was 2 hours on ITV. It was very much, as sort of Gavin hinted, it feels now like giving a voice to the voiceless, to giving a franchise to the disenfranchised, and giving a platform to people who in some ways kind of represent and symbolize ITV, the ITV viewer who'd been left out of the rather tragic asbestos equation and forgotten, and we just gave a voice to them. It's also quite striking how completely thorough the film is, in the sense that we covered so many aspects of asbestos, whether it's fraudulent death certificates, corporate dumping of asbestos in the third world, the levels of asbestos dust. We seem to cover the story from every angle in a way that was, if you watch the film all the way through, which of course I would urge you to do, is completely relentless. It is a film a bit like a sledgehammer. And it was partly that it was an ITV programme, and partly that I remember one of the things that Peter said during the making of the film, which is, we have to make this film unstoppable. We've got to make it unanswerable. And in a way, that's what we tried to do. And it's quite, when you see it, the whole film now, it's quite clear that that's what we set out to do. And I suppose also it feels like a journey of discovery, which I think the best documentaries probably are, where you don't quite know. You start out in one place and you finish up in another, and you're not quite sure how you get there, but you try to take the viewers along with you. And we, as we went through the process of the film, which took probably about a year. As we're making it, we're learning new things, meeting new people, and we're twisting and turning in terms of how we told that particular story over a period of time. So you get quite a strong sense, I think, from the overall film of a journey. And what did the film achieve? Well, I'll come back perhaps at the end just to sort of outline the things that the film changed. But I suppose that the most sort of clear-cut or powerful thing that someone said about the film afterwards was from someone called Dr. Alan Dalton, who was an environmental campaigner, really, and one of the sort of inspiration for the film. And he said a couple of years after it was made, there is no doubt that Alice changed the world landscape in relation to asbestos. A Swedish trade unionist came here and asked, why has the law changed here? It's because of Alice, no other reason. Asbestos is now finished. It's got us the best asbestos laws in the world. And probably when I die, if that was on my tombstone, I'd probably be quite happy if we'd have achieved that much. So perhaps just to get you a sort of feel of the film, I'll let show a few minutes just from the beginning of the film. There's a very brief clip at the beginning of a very handsome and attractive young man who's now no longer with us, or he's no longer attractive and young, but that's just a fleeting moment, so don't let that put you off. And it just gives you a sense of the sort of style and nature of the film. So if we could play the first clip for those in the booth. Thank you very much. After very careful research, we believe that the allegations we have to make are true. But our story begins thousands of miles away from here, in a strange Canadian mining town they've actually named Asbestos. These Canadian mines supply over half the Western world's white asbestos, including most of the 95,000 tons imported into Britain every year. Despite health scares in the mid-1970s, mining is still on a massive scale. Asbestos in Canada is big business. Exports are worth £300 million a year. Once the valuable asbestos fibres are extracted from this rock, they're pushed into every corner of our daily lives. Asbestos is all around us, in water pipes, pipe lagging, sheds and garages, oven gloves, ironing boards, simmering pads, oven doors, DIY wall plugging, protective clothing for firefighters, and the brakes and clutches of every car in thousands of trains. Asbestos can also kill you.
Please raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear the testimony you are about to give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth.
It's the asbestos from that same Canadian mine that's probably killing this woman.
Please state your full name.
Too ill to go to court, lawyers videotaped her evidence.
Can you describe how you would see the asbestos particles as they affected you?
Well, they look like snowflakes, real stringy, and they come down. They're pretty thick at that time.
What is it that you're presently suffering from?
And the asbestos is growing. It's all in, like grapes, all lumps. I'm living from day to day,
Since then, how has your physical condition progressed?
Look at me.
Next day, Mary Johnson died of cancer. She was killed by asbestos fibres so tiny they can't be seen by the naked eye. 2 million of them could fit on a pinhead. To most of us, Ray Price is the traditional public image of asbestos disease. In this 1975 film, Ray is suffering from asbestosis, a disease we've known about for generations, lungs scarred and clogged by asbestos dust. Alice has been hit by a recently discovered disease, more insidious and deadly than asbestosis, asbestos cancer.
No, little flower, did a good day.
Alice's cancer is called mesothelioma, or cancer of the lung lining.
Are you saying that for your tea?
It's invariably fatal.
Go on then. Bye-bye.
Its only established cause, the dust from asbestos. Alice is 47 years old. 30 years ago, when she was just 17, Alice worked for 9 months at Cape Asbestos in Yorkshire.
Well, I came off a farm, you know, to work there. I was in Lincolnshire. And, you know, it was just like haymaking on the indoors, you know. There was just white, thick dust all over, in your eyes and your nose, and it used to collect on my nostrils. You know, you used to have 2 big lumps of dust on your nostrils, and then you used to spit on your hands to get all the dust off your clothes, you know. It was to sweep up 3 and 4 times a day, and it was, you know, right thick. It was just like haymaking on the indoors.
Were you ever warned that working there could be dangerous, that you could finish up?
No, we used to fool about. We used to make wigs out of that. You know, like you fool about at work. We used to make wigs out of asbestos and put them on his heads. And, you know, no. I never thought it was dangerous at all.
Just to set a context for that, so you get an idea of the style of the film right from the beginning. And you know, this is ITV. It's 9 o'clock. We wanted to kind of grab people with the, you know, the human consequences of this, as well as explaining a bit about asbestos. There had at this point been a string of films made about asbestos, mainly by World in Action, but also by Panorama in the early part of the 70s, which had really made an impact and had helped lead to a government inquiry in 1976, I think, about the asbestos industry. But quite a lot of those recommendations had not been acted upon. And by the time we made this film, 1982, the asbestos industry said there's little concern about asbestos. The energy has gone out of the campaign against it. So I think the asbestos industry were feeling quite comfortable with how they'd ridden out quite a difficult few years. And in terms of the context of how we made it, as Gavin said, we formed a little team of investigative documentary makers, perhaps not really journalists, but we were kind of 1 foot in journalism, 1 foot in documentary making, and we'd made a film about runaway kids called Johnny Go Home, and then made a film called Goodbye Longfellow Road about housing and homelessness in East London, and then Rampton, the Secret Hospital. And they'd all made quite a noise, and we'd sort of almost inadvertently developed a sort of sub-genre, which was, in a way you can see here, beginning to form, which is a sort of mixture of very strong, documentary, powerful human experience mixed with investigative journalism. And quite often you would see a sort of a mixture of kind of social inequality mixed with, in the end, what turns out to be criminal behaviour, in the case of some of the nurses in Rampton or some of the people who exploited young boys on the streets of London. But the success of those films, they'd got won a lot of prizes and created a lot of attention, put us in a position where we were able to not quite decide exactly what films we made, but if we had a strong and passionate belief in a particular subject, there's a pretty good chance we would get it made. And in those days, of course, we had no commissioning editors, which was, of course, heaven sent universe. In the end, we had to hope there's not many commissioning editors here. Then if there's, I didn't really mean it. And my proposal will be on your desk in the morning. But I think that was, that meant that Yorkshire Television had a certain number of slots each year, and we could get on and make it. But because of that success, I say, as we had some control of our own destiny, but also we'd set the bar rather high. in every program we'd made had been very successful. We got big audiences. We got lots of prizes. What do you do next? And so I suppose I did, and James Cutler, who was the researcher on 3 of those films, who is probably for me the kind of best investigative journalist television has probably ever had. He was absolutely fantastic, if mad, but that's probably comes with the territory. And we were always, cutting out things, meeting people, just working on it. And we'd got an interest in asbestos, and I'd read a couple of books, and I'd been quite interested, but I wondered how we could move the story forward. And we had the idea that what had happened in the intervening 10 years between those fantastic World in Action films and this was that asbestos cancer had really become the story, and the nation and the legislators really just saw it as sort of old-fashioned asbestosis, a sort of industrial disease. And as sometimes happens when you're thinking about starting a film, it just begins by accident. And I was going to make a film in Central America, in Nicaragua, about the conflict in Nicaragua, and I went for an injection at Thomas Cook's, and the doctor who was injecting me, I just noticed the name, and he'd actually been a doctor in Hebden Bridge, where Alice lived and where Cape Asbestos, and it's called Bertram Mann. And I said, are you the Bertram Mann? Of course, he was very flattered, but that someone who'd just come for a jab for yellow fever had recognised him. We began a conversation, we talked about the various issues, and that started to give us an idea that we should really work further on asbestos. And we then made contact with a lobby group, which is actually one person in a semi in Enfield called Nancy Tate. And she had all these documents. She opened the fridge to get the milk out for tea, and the fridge was full of documents about asbestos. So we thought, well, there must be something here. Bit by bit, we started to get more interested in the story. And Nancy put us on to some cases because we knew we needed to find some the kind of human consequences of it all. And we met a marvellous woman called Georgina Stanfield, lived in Canning Town, and she was a sort of Cockney version of Alice in lots and lots of ways. But quite quickly after filming her, she died. And I think, to be honest about it, it just made us really angry. We were just so angry that someone who had such fantastic dignity was so appallingly treated, not just in terms of dying, but trying to get compensation and proper medical treatment. And that just sort of galvanized us and drove us on. And we decided that we would go ahead with this. Yorkshire Television were very, very supportive, partly on the basis of our track record. And we proceeded with the film, and we realised that we needed a spine to the film, and we found Alice and formed a kind of close relationship with her. And in a way, to make these sort of films and build these sort of relationships, you've almost got to be, it's almost like a love affair, I think. And we saw so much of Alice that we became very friendly with her, and we came to sort of adore her, really, because she was such an amazing person. And that's what kept you going every time Peter or James or I were going around the streets of Rochdale or Hebden Bridge looking for another victim, looking for another bit of evidence. You were driven on by the knowledge there was Alice somewhere down the road, and she was on her last legs. But of course, this sort of film has got to be more than just a portrait of one woman who was dying. And as we started to go on that journey of discovery, we moved beyond Cape Asbestos, who'd been dealt with in World in Action, and we came to a company called Turner and Newell's, because they were the model in Britain. They employed 5,000 people. It was their factories which was seen as the beacon for health and safety in this particular industry. They also had owned mines in Canada. They owned companies in the USA. They owned companies in the Third World, and they were clearly the biggest UK and indeed one of the world's biggest asbestos manufacturers. And we thought that if we tackled them rather than a smaller company, then we might get somewhere, but we knew it was a hard target. So just to give you an idea of the sort of investigation really led by Peter and James that we did, here's a sort of investigative part of the film, which is a lot of boring documents really, but I hope you'll get and understand what we were trying to do and how much work went in just to changing one statistic. So could we play the second tape, Marina? Thanks.
Donald, who is married with 4 children, was told he had the asbestos cancer, mesothelioma. Donald Robinson is aged 39. Turner's also told the asbestos inquiry that in the weaving shed, the factory showpiece, which for 30 years is kept to below the legal limits for asbestos dust, they had no disease whatsoever, that not one single weaver has contracted asbestos-related disease. But what about this man who worked in the weaving shed? Records show he had suspected asbestosis. That was in January 1968, fully 8.5 years before Turner stated they had no disease whatever amongst weavers. He wasn't the only one, as these records from that same year, 1977, show. The number of weavers with suspected asbestosis, not nil, but 13. Among them, Joe Testaferrata Donato. The medical records show he had asbestosis. That was in 1977. But Turner's let him continue work with asbestos and didn't move him out of the danger area.
We've got a document which shows that Mr. Donato was a definite case of asbestosis. Did you ever know anything about that?
No, he wasn't. But he was never told that.
Well, this document here says, it's in the document.
Look, just a minute. I knew Joe Donato. There's no way that Joe knew anything about this at all. This is disgraceful.
Was he ever moved?
No, certainly not. He worked with me for the last 10 years. We were back-to-back partners. There's no way that Joe knew that he'd got asbestosis.
A few months after that last checkup, and nearly 6 years after the company doctor first diagnosed lung damage, Joe Donato died of lung cancer. He was 54. Turner's also stated to the asbestos inquiry that they had 48 cases of mesothelioma, but that none of these could be described as cases of slight exposure to asbestos. But Margaret Crimes worked here as Turner's telephonist. Emma Marshall was Turner's office cleaner, but they both died of the asbestos cancer, mesothelioma. This is Turner's own list of mesotheliomas. Among the exposure times, 16 months, 1 year, 7 months, 5 months, 3 years, and the last one, a woman exposed for just 10 days. In this 1980 questionnaire, Turner's told one of the unions that the number of mesotheliomas in the previous 4 years was just 3. In the same period, we found 6. Turner's also told the unions, in 1980, the level of asbestosis between 1950 and 1979 was just 20. We found 81. Even 2 years before that questionnaire, Turner's knew of at least 31, as their own list, complete with dates certified by the government panel, shows. We found 50 more cases on death certificates. The total, not 20 cases, but 81. The real figure must be higher, because death certificates often fail to record industrial disease. Margaret Priestley, for example, was a jolly 17-stone woman. Before she died, she shrank to an unrecognizable 8 stone. Officially, she was 70% disabled with asbestosis. But there was no mention of asbestos on the death certificate. Yet this government panel report reveals her death was due to asbestosis. Edward Wellings died in 1981. He had asbestosis for 16 years before he died. Yet his death certificate stated he died from heart trouble. The Rochdale coroner even refused to hold an inquest. But this pathologist's report shows that Edward Wellings in fact had asbestos in his lungs. Even worse, he had cancer of the lung. But neither cancer nor asbestos was on the death certificate. As a result, his widow never got the special pension which Turners normally give to asbestos widows.
I don't see why I should suffer for 16 years and then say I ain't got it. And I think
Well, I just think Turner's getting away with murder.
Turner's told the asbestos inquiry in 1977 that the prevalence of asbestos disease in their British factories was no more than 1 in 300. Yet Dr. Geoffrey Morris, then Turner's chief medical officer and a former university lecturer, was within months concluding that the definite or strongly suspected cases of asbestosis at Turner's Rochdale was not 1 in 300, but more than 1 in 4, after just 10 years at work. Soon after, Turner's and Dr. Morris parted company. The main asbestos inquiry authors never received Dr. Morris's vital 1 in 4 findings from Turner's, and they were never published.
I think that no scientific fact which is properly conducted should be hidden under the pillow. It should be allowed the light of day and given the chance of the eminent scientists in this country and others to criticise.
And is that what happened in this case? It was hidden under the pillow?
It was never asked for.
So I hope that gives you an idea of the amount of work that went in. We spent £1,200 just on buying death certificates, which is one of the probably the only item in a budget that's ever had death certificates, £1,200. And there was a huge amount of work went on just day by day, week by week, just doing what was called shoe leather epidemiology, just sheer perspiration and shoe leather, actually getting the information.
How did you get the figures of death to know to go to look for the death certificates in the first place?
Well, we got the figures of death from a whole range of different sources, from trade unions, some from a shop steward, some from the doctor, some we found in, there were some tucked away in publications. So we just scoured every possible source to get as much information as possible. So just to go on to the next clip, what we also wanted to show, and it's part of the sort of unstoppability that Peter described, was that this wasn't just illness that affected working class people in the north of England or in Scotland, but actually was much broader than that. So we spent a little bit of time filming in the USA, where there were some quite dramatic and shocking cases, and it just gives you an idea of how casual and how ubiquitous this particular illness is. Do you want to show the third clip, Marina? Thank you.
Frances Harrick died peacefully in her sleep. This little boy has never seen his father. 5 weeks before he was born, his father died of asbestos cancer. John Rossi was a Wall Street lawyer. His asbestos exposure was incredibly slight. Aged 20, he loaded white asbestos sheets onto lorries for just 2 weeks. But those 2 weeks were enough. At 32, he died of the asbestos cancer, mesothelioma.
I've lost the most important thing in my life. I think it's very lucky when one man and one woman can somehow find each other and love each other as much as John and I did. We were best friends to each other, laughed a lot, had great plans for our future together, look forward to growing old together. It was just taken away from me. And from him.
America's most famous asbestos cancer victim, Steve McQueen, exposed to asbestos as a Marine and in some of his films. He tried every treatment his money could buy. At a Mexican clinic, he recorded this tape.
Congratulations to your wonderful country on the magnificent work that the Mexican doctors, assisted by the American doctors, are doing at the Playa Santa Maria Hospital. and helping in my recovery from cancer. And thank you for helping to save my life. God bless you all. Steve McQueen.
But even Steve McQueen couldn't beat asbestos cancer. He died soon afterwards. Don Carson is a heavy goods mechanic. At work, he used to blow white asbestos dust out of brake drums when he was changing the linings. In their holidays, his sons used to help him. In 1980, when his eldest boy Johnny was 11, his parents were told their son had the asbestos cancer, mesothelioma.
Oh, I really went to pieces. And so did John. I think we just looked at each other. And John said, "Why me?" And I couldn't answer him. And I called Don and I told him that they were malignant. And he just went to pieces too. You know, this always happens to somebody else. It's not going to happen to you. You know, that was... And I think we're really happy. Like, you know, when I was told what it was, I knew it was incurable because they had told us that. And there wasn't anything we could do. We had to sit and watch our son die and not be able to stop it.
I never had anything hurt so bad in my life. John could do 50 push-ups last summer. And then just before he died, he couldn't even lift his foot back up on the wheelchair. And that just killed me because he was so athletic.
We watched especially his arms and legs. They shrunk to just nothing. There was no muscle left. If you went to touch him, it was very painful because all there was bone. I couldn't hug him. If you hugged him, it hurt. Couldn't hold his hand. You couldn't sit next to him. He tried. And he'd be quiet about it, but you knew it hurt. Just hurt him to even just hug him. There was nothing left.
On April the 13th, 1981, Johnny Carson had a small party at his home. That night he died peacefully in his sleep. He was 12 years old.
Just for one day, I'd like those asbestos manufacturers to have the pain, to have the cancer for one day. Just watch him. And I can guarantee they'd never do it again.
Running through that was a sort of secondary theme of the film. One of the other new things that we were trying to... one of the other new things we were trying to say, and as a sort of theme in the film, was that actually the asbestos industry had for quite a long time said, blue asbestos is what kills you, that's the one with a particular kind of fibre, and white asbestos is safe. So that engendered a sense of complacency, probably, in quite a lot of places. And it was quite clear from that sort of evidence where someone was blowing white asbestos out of brake drums, which is not working in a factory that makes blue asbestos, that white asbestos for some people wasn't safe either, and we were complacent at our peril. But we were able, through going on our journey to Canada and the USA and to India, eventually to come back to Rochdale and to bring back a kind of contrast between what the compensation was like in the USA and what it was like in Rochdale. So this is the last clip, and then we can talk about it if you want. But this is the last clip. So can we play that clip, Marina? Thanks.
With an ashen face. His mates in Hackney told us more about him.
Sorry. That was Johnny. The last bit of Johnny Go Home you got for a bonus. So.
Dana Bond has been widowed because of asbestos. Her case made American legal history. Her husband Richard, who who worked for just a few months with asbestos, using a process invented by Turner and Newell and exported to America. Then this healthy, fit man developed asbestos cancer. His lawyers recorded this tape.
You solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give the truth, full truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yeah.
Will you state your name, sir?
It's Willis.
Where do you live, sir?
I live in Fountain, Illinois.
How old a man are you?
32.
Are you married or single?
Married.
What is your wife's name?
Dana Bunny.
Do you have any children?
3.
Sir, prior to your health problem, what had been your business or occupation?
I was a teacher. I coached varsity basketball, coached football.
Are you suffering a particular illness at this time, sir? What is, or do you understand what it is or what they call it?
Pleural mesothelioma, asbestosis.
Asbestosis and mesothelioma.
3 days after this testimony was taken, Richard Bond died, aged 32. Turners and their American agents paid his widow $1,400,000 compensation. That's nearly £750,000. Compare then the fortunes of Dana Bond with £750,000 from Turners to ease her financial worries to those of Ada Brown of Rochdale. Like Dana Bond, she's a Turner's asbestos widow. Like Dana Bond, her husband died of the asbestos cancer, mesothelioma. Soon after he died, a man from Turner's visited her.
He sat down, had a chat with me and that, you know, and he said, well, Turner's had decided to give me this gift of £200. And at the time I was very upset because I thought it was awful. And I thought I'd go home no more. Just talking about it was...
When you say it was awful, the £200, what do you mean?
For a man's life. And there's others like him, isn't there?
So when the film was shown, we'd been trying to get Turner and Newell's to appear in the film for about 4 or 5 months and written them many letters, and actually they've made a decision not to appear in the film, which in one way was a relief because we didn't have to insert them into the film, but it did mean that we had to sort of test every piece of evidence, every thought in the film against our own sort of journalistic standards about whether they stood up, and we were pretty ruthless about what we included or what we didn't include. When the film was shown at 9 o'clock, it got, I think, 8.1 million viewers at 9 o'clock. And then, in a way more powerfully, at 10:35, after news at 10, what happened was that it was the day when the IRA bombed the Horse Guards. So lots of horses and soldiers were killed that day, and the news was extended to 10:50. So we didn't actually get on air till 10:55. You could hardly, if you've spent a long time on this, you could hardly imagine a worse bit of timing. But actually, 5.7 million viewers stayed up to watch the film, despite the grisly news and despite the nature of the subject, and they stayed up till nearly midnight to watch the film. The next morning, the shares of Turner and Newell lost £60 million on the stock exchange. They went down from 65p to 23. Within 10 days, the government reduced the level of asbestos dust in factories. And there are a whole string of other smaller licensing system for laggers, some inquiries, some of the asbestos regulations from the 76-77 inquiry implemented. And eventually, in a way, almost for us, one of the sort of pleasing things about it is that one of the women you saw in, I think, the second or third clip, Jessie Wellings, whose husband had died and the death certificate got it wrong, we actually managed to get that decision overturned, a new death certificate, and she got £25,000 as a result. Not much, but £25,000. And I remember that she went with a friend on a cruise around the world, and as far as I can see, just partied and drunk the £25,000 away and had a fantastic time, which actually I think made us feel pretty good about it. And that's it, really. That's how the story ended, and it had quite a lot of consequences. And in a way, what really gave it its strength was actually the people in it, particularly Alice. And I think one of the things that spearheaded change was not what the press said or what we said or what the legislators said. We had quite a lot of actually hostility from the legislators before transmission. Turner's roped in Barbara Castle and Cyril Smith, local MPs, who were very hostile about the film, even though Barbara Castle never actually seen the film. And after transmission, we had to appear in front of a select committee, and we were basically accused of being communists. The word, communist was used, and Turner and Newell's hired a detective, a private detective, to, as far as I can see, to stalk. For some reason, I was fine. I was a director, but the researchers were deeply dangerous and were seen as someone who, were dangerous enemies of the state. So, what their tactic was afterwards to dig up as much dirt about us as we could and rubbish it while not appearing in the programme. But in the end, it was ground upwards, and I remember a march in the streets of Sheffield where people had their own placards which just said "Remember Alice" with a picture of Alice on. And actually, it was the story of Alice that meant that many, many ordinary people wrote to us, wrote to their MPs, and actually lobbied for change, because actually what was happening in asbestos factories and in the asbestos industry was affecting people like them. So that's the story of the film, but I'm happy to answer any questions or have a discussion.
Please speak into the mic.
Hi, Rosie Waterhouse. I teach at City University. I'm interested to know, did Turner and Newell... Can you not? You really can't hear me.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3. It doesn't work. Hello? Hello? Can you put it up, Troy?
Yeah. I'm sure you can hear me.
It's just we're filming, that's the problem.
Okay, yeah. Is that working now? Okay, yeah. Did Turner and Newell ever threaten to sue? And how did they try to counter your allegations?
I can't remember. I don't think that I'm sure that they probably said that they were going to sue, but I think they'd realised that they'd made an error in not appearing in the programme, or maybe it wasn't an error, but they'd made that decision. And I think that when they realised that it was going to be a difficult programme, to say the least, for them, then they started to try to find other ways of dealing with it. So they rang the chairman of Yorkshire Television, for example. The chairman of Turner and Newell's rang the chairman of Yorkshire Television and said, your boys are behaving badly, what are you going to do about it? We play golf together, sort of thing. They got hold of their MPs, Barbara Castle, Cyril Smith, as I said, but it was afterwards, really, that they started to try to rubbish our figures, get their own investigations going, try to undermine the credibility of the researchers. It was really afterwards, I think, that most of the campaigning against the programme came, because I think they underestimated how much effect the film would have. I don't know, Peter, whether you've got any memories of Turner and Newell's. You were the one who was stalked.
It's not really some terrible sort of old anecdotes from very decrepit old journalists. But when I worked with another guy called James Cutler, and James used to say, "I think we're being followed." And I used to say, "Well, I think you're paranoid, James." And it's only much later on that in discovery documents in an American trial, we realised we were being followed, and that, of course, James was absolutely right, as always. I think on the whole, they tried tried to discredit the film after it was made, and ultimately they changed their ways. The company diversified out of asbestos and did a lot better, actually. So there was a sort of strange morality tale that although they did stop purveying asbestos, they became much more profitable by changing the products that they made.
Did they try and injunct you?
No, I don't think they did try and injunct us. Actually, most of the other programs I mentioned had been done, but they didn't try to injunct us. I think that it was until very, very late in the day. I think they only realised when it started to have some advanced publicity in the Radio Times and one or two press that they suddenly started to really panic and think this was serious. I don't know why they hadn't sort of tweaked it before, but it was only at that point. And I think by then we had offered them the right of reply, on more than one occasion, and they turned it down. So it was actually getting quite difficult for them to say that we treated them, say, unfairly, because we had the evidence that they'd turned down that opportunity, which is probably lucky.
Hi there, how you doing? You've mentioned a lot of the reasons why you think it was effective in affecting change, such as the sort of personal interest, the sort of new subgenre of kind of documentary making, and also the large number of people who watched it initially. I'm just wondering, how did 8.1 million people come to watch it in the first place? Was there a lot of prior press about it? I just imagine that was one of the key reasons why so many people were able to put pressure on the government and for these things to take off.
Well, I think in those days, we weren't living in a multi-channel landscape, so there was less competition. Even Channel 4 hadn't been invented, so this was only a choice of 3 channels. On the other hand, I think it was in the top 20 programs of that week. I think it was at number 19, and actually the other programs I've mentioned too all got in the top 20. So these were very popular programs, and I think one of the reasons was that they were there wasn't a huge amount of advanced publicity apart from just before transmission, when we obviously assembled a bit of a press campaign. We started to show people the tapes, and there started to be articles appearing about it, so it started to look like it was something that people were going to talk about, and therefore the audience didn't want to miss it. And also it was heavily trailed on air. We pushed it hard on air, but I think we thought 8 million viewers, and particularly 5.7, nearly 8 million viewers at 10:55 at night was pretty amazing, considering the subject matter is it's not a barrel of laughs, is it? So but it was promoted. It was promoted hard. It's 2 hours right in. It's 2 hours of a sort of 4 or 5 hour night on any television channel, and therefore ITV did get very behind it in terms of on-air promotion.
Sorry, just a wee follow-up question. Do you think that actually then with kind of online streaming of video content now kind of becoming more and more the norm, that sort of shared experience of everyone watching the same documentary at the same time and being able to exert that sort of pressure on the wider body politic, as it were, do you think that will actually have any impacts, on negative or positive, in fact?
Well, it's clearly more difficult now. There's more and more channels, but you can sometimes. When I was at the BBC, my department made a film called The Secret Policeman about racism in the Manchester Police, and that got 5.5 million viewers. But the police tried to stop it. David Blunkett tried to stop it. It became a front-page story, as well as a pretty scandalous story. And I felt that it was a subject of radio phone-ins, newspaper editorials, and actually it did still hold together quite a large body of the British citizens who'd talked about it and watched it. So it's still just about possible, but it's clearly much more difficult. It is hard to imagine a 2-hour film about asbestos on ITV. It's hard to imagine a 10-minute film about asbestos on ITV probably now. No, it's clearly difficult. But Channel 4, BBC 2, and actually The Secret Police was, on peak time on BBC 1. So it's still just about there, but it's hanging on by its fingernails, really. And I think there is an effect that mass television can have that it can be quite powerful, that is going to become more and more difficult to achieve.
I'm still reeling from 2 hours, 9 o'clock on ITV for 2 hours as a documentary. You were talking about the sort of slings and arrows that are thrown at you, communists, whatever. One of the slings and arrows, which actually is I've found in my time doing this sort of thing, is more difficult to cope with, is that of you're a campaigner, and that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. But do you not, in those films, which were all very campaigning films, where's the line? Did you feel, yeah, I am a campaigner, or did you think, no, I'm not, I'm a programme maker, and I will move on? It's a difficulty, isn't it? What are your thoughts on the campaigner label?
I don't think that we were campaigners. We made the films about subjects that we cared about and we thought were important, but what we did, in a way, was lay our evidence in front of the viewer, albeit shaped in a way that we thought was as effective as possible to communicate with that viewer. But in terms of campaigning, that's not what we do. There's lots of charities, politicians, trade unions who actually can campaign about a whole range of different subjects. And so you present the material and you have to leave it to others to continue. If for a moment asbestos rises up the ladder of public interest, then you have to allow it for others to campaign and use it for a campaign if they want it. But I don't think we saw it as a campaign. We saw it as an investigation or a discovery that we then presented. It happened to be something that we felt keenly about, otherwise we wouldn't have spent so long doing it. But I think if we were going to campaign about asbestos, we would have gone on and made lots of other films about it.
How much were you worried about your budget during that year? How often were you looking at your figures?
Did we have a budget? I don't remember that. Well, I think we were lucky. I mean, in the end, this film cost, in those days of budgeting, £60,000 above the line. And in the end, we got, with the discussion program, we got 3 hours of television in a year for £60,000. What it didn't include was the salaries, which were below the line cost. I don't know exactly what they came to. We only just budgeted in those days above the line because Peter, James, and I were all on the staff. That was sort of carried for in central cost. So so we were concerned about it. Of course, we wanted to keep in budget, but I think we got ourselves in a rather privileged position where, because we'd had a lot of success in the past, no one was really going to stop us and say no to us. But also, we were kind of sensible and careful, and we didn't go mad. But we knew that investigative journalism it doesn't come cheap.
And I think you said we should put our expenses into Emmerdale Farm.
Yes, Emmerdale Farm had a very expensive year that year, I think, because of the expenses. Yes, a lot of death certificates on their budget, I think.
Jason Addy, I live in Rochdale and I'm not a journalist, but I must say that Alice Fight for Life has changed my life. My question, I think shadows what a lot of other people have said here today, is it's 25 years since Alice Fight for Life was produced. The story of asbestos for decades has been one of lies and obfuscation, and your diligent research, and I must stress it's not campaigning, I've got a lot of the documents that you used to research from and documents from TNN afterwards. I've probably 20, 30 boxes full of documents. So I know just the amount of work that yourself and your researchers did. My question is that, could there ever be a documentary like that again? Again, I'm not a media person, I'm not a journalist, but what I do see is that you were given the remit and you were given a year, expenses to challenge a multinational company head on and win, and in the past 25 years proven time and time again to be vindicated. My observations now in 2007 is that unfortunately there doesn't appear to be television companies and broadcasters with the guts and the determination to stand by their reporters and fight such fights.
I think it's I think that's a. I'm speechless. No, I think it's I think it's a fair point. It's we were lucky. We were at a particular moment, and we'd got ourselves into a position where we had control of our own destiny in terms of what we made, and we went on after that to make another film about Windscale. So we did, I think, 4 or 5 of these films. And in other things that I've done since, we have done quite a lot of investigative journalism, but it is indeed, I think it's really hard to imagine in the conversations that I have with broadcasters on a day-to-day basis, a lot of which are very serious, and they're very interested in what's happening in Iraq and lots of really important issues, or the environment and global warming, things that are really critical to the future of the world. There's a lot of keen interest in them. But I think in terms of this kind of investigative journalism, about a subject that seems a bit Rochdale and dour and difficult, I think that it's much more difficult to achieve. And I think one of the reasons for it is actually that ITV has lost its regional roots. One of the great things about ITV is that there were people like us living in Leeds, and actually almost at the end of the street where Yorkshire Television was a Turner & Newell's factory, J.W. Roberts, which was actually the most lethal of them all. And I remember a woman who worked in the canteen at Yorkshire Television telling how her husband had died. This was actually after we'd made the film, not before it. And it was the end of your street. Now it's all centralised into London. People aren't living outside London and having a story on their doorsteps that affects them and affects the rest of the nation. So I think it is much more difficult now. It's perhaps it's impossible. I honestly don't know. But if I went into even Channel 4 and said I'd like to make a big film about asbestos for these reasons, I think it would be pretty hard going. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
John, you said you had a lot of editorial freedom at Yorkshire. As Turner & Newell's turned up the heat on you on this film, was there ever any time that your journalism was scrutinised, or you felt that you weren't supported by the broadcaster?
I think we were lucky in that Yorkshire Television then was run by Paul Fox, who had been a senior figure in the BBC, had come up through Panorama. He was a robust journalist himself, and we made the programmes. We had lawyers all over them, and with almost all of them, he would come on and say, "There's been a phone call from the chairman of Turner & Newell's. There's been a complaint from Barbara Castle. There's been, in other ones, the Minister of Health's been on the phone." And he'd come down. Sometimes he'd look at the programme. Well, usually he would just say, go through it with me. And you would explain what it was about and why you believed it to be true and what the evidence was. And he's, on this occasion, he just said, "They deserve it," and walked away. Didn't even look at the film. So he was, very trusting of us and of the kind of head of the department was called John Fairley, who was also a very good journalist, and he trusted us to get on with it. And we asked some very robust questions about our methodology and what our intentions were. But as soon as he was satisfied, he then just saw off all comers, really. And we were lucky. We had a culture. And the same thing happened at Granada. Granada had had a journalistic culture at its heart, and it meant that people could make these programs without fear. Just like Menton, we are now. So Alice and I work together at Menton now, so it's just the same. I hope.
Hey there. I'd just like to sort of I slightly concur with what the gentleman said earlier about this is seemingly kind of much more difficult to do nowadays. It's actually take on corporations head on, certainly for funding reasons. but also possibly because of the savviness that large corporations have kind of learned how to deal with and set up large press shields against such reporting. I'm just very interested in actually your experiences when you were contacting Turner and Newell. I mean, were you in direct contact with them, and at what level? Just if you could elaborate on that, would be fascinating.
Yeah, of course. No, we were in contact with them. I think that now the sort of procedure and rules are tougher than they were then, but we were in contact with the press office, we were in contact with the chief executive, we wrote them a letter saying we're making a film about asbestos, it featured their factory. We didn't go into how many deaths we'd found and all the detail, but we asked them for a cooperation to film in the factory and for an interview, and they'd made a decision not to. I think that you're right that what has happened is that lots of corporations have become more sophisticated, and this is 25 years ago, are more sophisticated in how they deal with the media. They have lobbyists, they have members of parliament, they understand how to delay things, how to obfuscate, how to make it more difficult to make the programme. And actually, even at that time, I would have thought that Turner and Newell's, as a big international company, would have been a bit more sophisticated. Funnily enough, I think being Yorkshire Television helped because they probably thought, it's some bloody, tiddling little piddly TV station up the road. It's not Thames or anyone we've ever heard of much. So it's probably just a bloody local programme. Maybe that was a sort of. I don't think they just spotted the danger, but you're absolutely right that lots of organisations, government included, they've become much more sophisticated at how they deal with the media and understand it much more than they did in those days.
I made one of the World in Actions you were very kind about back in 1971, and I think the thing you and I have to say to today's generation sitting here is essentially what's happened since your film and our film was made is Mrs. Thatcher deregulated British television. And whereas back in the old days Paul Fox, David Playwright were buttressed by regulation in the media that said you will have tough journalism as part of the mix of your programs, you do not now have any such regulation. Secondly, another major difference between television now and television then, there was a chasm, an absolute chasm, between the money coming in from the commercials and the money going out to make programs. That is now a misty area. Money comes in, and in some cases it clearly directly goes into the making of programs. I mean, motoring programs have always been notoriously in the pockets of the motoring companies. That's sort of obvious, but there are more subtle examples of that. I would say that the particular thing about asbestos that makes it, of all the topics we ever investigated, particularly insidious, is the way in which you had a one-night stand with asbestos 25 years ago, and now you get mesothelioma. The vast gap that many cases show between the time when that brief time, 7 days, you did a holiday job when you were a student, and now, a quarter of a century later, suddenly you've got this killer disease. One of the most ironic things about it, which Gavin knows about, is we, Granada, made that program in 1971. In the mid-1980s, shortly after your program, Granada was refurbishing its studios. And it turned out the studios had asbestos lagging in the roof. And now, 25 years later, various electricians and one producer, a good friend of ours, died last year of mesothelioma. Now, he had nothing to do anywhere in his life with asbestos, but the studios were being cleaned, obviously not particularly carefully. He ingested one microscopic bit of asbestos, and 25 years later, from diagnosis to his deathbed, was 8 months. And all he'd done was eat in the canteen the same time as the men who were cleaning the studios. The reason why most of the deaths in former Granada people are electricians is because the asbestos was principally in the roof of the ceilings. Electricians, as you know, spend their time on gantries high up near the roof. It appears that the asbestos may have been gently letting dust down into the studio, and the people who were nearest to that dust were the electricians up on the gantries. The problem is, of course, that the Granada that is now faced with various compensation claims is a wholly different company to the Granada that made the television programs in the 1970s.
No, I mean, I agree with you. It's the time lag makes it a pretty frightening. But I don't quite agree about television. I agree about ITV, and for those of us who worked in ITV, it did have a really, really strong sense that one of the ways it related to its audience was strong journalism, very often on behalf of its average viewers. And for Yorkshire and Thames and Granada, the programmes all ensured that they passed all the quality thresholds to win their franchises back. So it was valuable to them, and it's really sad that ITV doesn't do that anymore, and that it's out of competition. But actually, we've still got a public-funded broadcaster in the BBC, and we have Channel 4 who has a public remit, and there shouldn't be, despite the increased competition, there should still be more space than there is now for investigative journalism, particularly on the BBC, I think. It's there. I know I've been involved with quite a bit of it, but nonetheless, I don't feel it's right at the heart of what the BBC feels it does, unlike news gathering, say, and in the way that it felt like right at the centre of Yorkshire Television and at the centre of Granada when we were there.
That's right. I have to confess I've not seen your film, but for no other reason that in 1980...
DVDs are available afterwards, signed copies an extra £5.
Okay. Oh, well. Okay, I was going to say, in 1982, 9 o'clock was way past my bedtime. Well, obviously, from the bits we have seen, it's obviously very powerful and extremely persuasive. So what I'm curious to know is, after it was shown, on what basis did the company try and defend itself? And did people like Barbara Castle try and attack you? Presumably, the existence and integrity of the symptoms must have been beyond dispute. So were they just denying that it was asbestos that caused them, or were they denying that they knew it? Or
no, I think they were denying. They were denying the evidence, the figures. Our doctors say one thing, our statistics say one thing. These people aren't doctors. They're journalists. How do they know what they're doing? All the government inspectors show we have a very clean factory. How could this have happened? This has been made up. We haven't had our right to reply. We haven't appeared in the programme. You haven't heard outside of the story. Although a week later we did, and in a way that kept the debate going in the press for another week. And then there was insidiously when we appeared at the Parliamentary Select Committee, the first question from the chairman, John Gorst, was about our communist leanings. So then there was a bit of smearing going on while they're at it as well. So, I think they just tried everything they possibly could. But in the end, it was quite difficult for them to really deny the figures, even if, we were right, and, we very, very carefully underestimated the figures. The figures were worse than we put in the programme, but if we weren't absolutely 110% sure of a death certificate, a cause of death, we didn't include it. So instead of being 81, it was probably more than that in the weaving shed, but we stuck it at 81. We played safe, so that if it came to a round 2, we'd pull out some more if we had to. So it was an attack on our integrity, attack on the methods, an attack on our politics, I suppose, or lack of it.
Hi, I'm Ed Howker. I've written in Private Eye magazine about the Rochdale factory that's featured in the documentary, predominantly because a property developer's got hold of it now and is trying to build 600 homes on the site. I wonder, that seems to me quite a good example, especially given the fact that, the 72-acre site is clearly extremely badly contaminated with asbestos. I wonder the extent to which you feel that the story of asbestos is has been told, and that there is sufficient public attention about it. And I mean, as a filmmaker who's done so much, I mean, do you find that you keep a tab on exactly how stories run their courses over sort of the times that you finish them?
Well, I think you do. I suppose you take a sort of amateur interest. So yes, if I see a book about asbestos, I buy it. If I've seen there's an article on page 3 of the Times today about I read it. So I keep an interest, and a little bit of something in the back of my mind thinks, 25 years of Alice, should we make another film? And then I look in the mirror and think, oh, maybe not. So you do keep an interest in it, but the story's changed, and actually in the intervening time, there are a couple of follow-up films that Yorkshire Television did, and the debate moved on to things like the pressure on the insurance companies, perhaps your stories in Private Eye. So people aren't worrying about the dust levels in factories now, but they're worrying about compensation for people dying many years later or whatever. The story is still there, and you keep an interest in it. But I'm not an expert in asbestos anymore, but I take an amateur interest in it, I suppose.
Anyone else? I would add one PS. There has been, I don't know if you have any comment on this, there has been a considerable amount of manoeuvring by presumably very well-paid lawyers to counterclaim. You have to prove that the asbestos that is giving you your disease was my asbestos, that you got it in my factory. Unless you can absolutely prove that, your claim falls.
No, I think that that has been one of the the key issues in all compensation claims, which is where was the lining of your lung abused? And in some cases, people may have worked, particularly say the lagging industry, they've lagged for different companies. They might have worked in the services, and they've worked, for a private company, and they've worked for a local authority, and they've lagged with lots of different employers. And there may be 7 or 8 employers. So which is the one? What was the deadly fibre? They got them, and that's makes it more difficult, I think, to get compensation. Yes.
So I am a lawyer.
So you look like a lawyer, so I think that's the nicest possible way.
Well, that's not my area of specialism, but I happen to know a bit about it. What I was going to say is that you're quite right. One of the things you have to prove in a claim is that the negligence you've shown, the breach of duty of care, has actually caused the disease. And ordinarily you would have to show that it was your particular asbestos as opposed to somebody else's. Asbestos is actually quite a complex disease because it's not cumulative. It could just happen one day or not happen, and that's it. But what's happened in this particular area of law is that they've made a new rule largely just for asbestos cases, which is that if you can show that all these employers have been negligent, then it doesn't matter which one caused it. They're all deemed to have done so, and they all will have to compensate you. And I think, as I say, for asbestos cases have set that very new rule.
No, that sounds...
That's quite a sensible way to deal with it.
Sounds sensible, yeah. For a lawyer. I mean, for the law, I mean.
I'm also a lawyer, and I actually do practice in this area.
They're everywhere. I thought there was a club for journalists. Are there any commissioning editors here? That's what I'm really worried about.
Just to clarify what the gentleman in front was saying, he is correct that there is a new law that specifies that any exposer can be held liable. That is only applicable in mesothelioma cases, where the claimant has asbestosis, which is a dose-related disease, which is a cumulative disease. You have to pursue all of the exposers. The other issue that you raised about proving that it was necessarily your asbestos, it's a civil case, so you only have to show it's probable that it was somebody's asbestos that caused your illness to succeed against them.
Thank you. But actually, one of the interesting things in the States, the change has actually been driven by lawyers. And it's partly that, I almost showed a clip, there's a fantastic American lawyer in the film called Ron Motley, and quite young man who'd grown up in the southern parts of the United States with people who then owned asbestos companies, and he just set out to get them. But it was partly that the laws in America meant that if he was successful, he became incredibly rich, and so American lawyers have actually driven. I mean, there's been a war really between the lawyers and the companies, and the lawyers have been one of the driving forces behind changing things in the States.
I'm not going to introduce myself as a lawyer, even though I am a barrister, but stop to... non-practicing...
Okay, is there any journalists here? Just put your hands up, please. Okay.
I actually...
you don't look like a barrister.
No, it's been a while.
You're a lawyer? Well, I thought you were a journalist.
No, I just have that hungry look. I forgot where I was now. Yes. Going back to 25 years on, and a lot of the facts that you established and have been vindicated over the years. The one regarding white asbestos, which I will say categorically is a cause of mesothelioma.
Yeah.
Undisputable. However, if there's anybody here from the Sunday Telegraph, please turn your recorders on now. For the past 4 years, a chap called Christopher Booker has written in the news section of the Sunday Telegraph, and over the last 4 years has written articles regarding asbestos. He has said on repeated times that white asbestos is harmless, has never caused mesothelioma, and all this is a £1 billion con. One of the reasons why I became a campaigner and made sure that I could not be called an ambulance chaser or anything like that, so walked away from the law, is so that I can challenge gentlemen like that. In 2007, people are still saying that white asbestos is harmless. They're crackpots. There's people that I would liken to the Flat Earth Society, but they're out there, and there are people reading hundreds of thousands of newspapers reading that nonsense. And it must still be said that white asbestos, all forms of asbestos in respirable fibres, can cause irreversible lung disease, including mesothelioma.
Well, that's good, and I agree. And that was key. One of the points of our film was to try to challenge that perspective, which the asbestos companies clearly promulgated at that time with a lot of, because it suited them pretty well. But you could see from some of the cases we had who'd only been involved, like the Johnny Carson, the young 12-year-old boy who'd only, white asbestos was his only exposure. So I'm absolutely sure that you're right, and actually it's a terribly irresponsible and dangerous thing to do, to say that it's it's a con. It clearly isn't, and all the evidence suggests that it isn't. So good luck.
John, thanks very much.